Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe's congressional briefing on decolonizing Russia, a moral and strategic imperative. Now, from the very beginning, I would like to emphasize a few points about today's hearing. Today's discussion is not a mere brain-stimulating, yet largely esoteric exercise in a lip service to a zeitgeisty topic. It's also not an effort to be controversial or edgy just for the sake of likes and retweets. Today is a discussion to look at the foundational reasons for Russia's aggressive and brutal foreign policy that is leaving innocent people dead, displaced, and hurt in ways difficult to imagine. Understanding those reasons will help us craft policies and come up with ideas that will actually contain Russia and make a long-term peace on the Eurasian continent and beyond a possibility. Tragically and ironically to an extent, these are the very same reasons you see ethnic minority Russians dying in Putin's senseless war in Ukraine in larger proportions than ethnic Russians. Without addressing the core of this, we'll only be applying a band-aid to a wound that will inevitably start gushing blood, in this case, literally. And that brings us to the subject of today's discussion, the issue of decolonizing Russia. Russia's barbaric war in Ukraine has exposed the Russian Federation's viciously imperial character, something that has been apparent to an acute observer for some time, but now it's apparent to the entire world. Let me make it clear. Ukraine is not the first, and if left unchecked, it won't be the last instance of this. Russia has for decades now waged wars on people of Chechnya, Syria, Georgia. This aggression also is catalyzing a long overdue conversation about Russia's interior empire, given Moscow dominion over many indigenous non-Russian nations, and the extent to which the Kremlin has taken to suppress their national self-expression and self-determination. I want to make it clear, these conversations are not new. They have been percolating in the community and indeed among nations and ethnic groups that have been subject of Russia's colonial policies. But it is after the start of Russia's war in Ukraine that serious discussions are now underway about reckoning with Russia's imperialism and the need to colonize Russia, for it to become a viable stakeholder in European security and stability. As a successor to the Soviet Union, which cloaked its colonial agenda in anti-imperial and anti-capitalist nomenclature, Russia has yet to attract appropriate scrutiny for its consistent and oftentimes brutal imperial tendencies. And that is precisely the reason we have gathered our distinguished panel today. Without further delay, let me introduce our panel. We have a tremendous panel today, and from Ukraine, we have Dr. Hanna Hofka. She chaired the Foreign Affairs Committee of Ukrainian Parliament from 2014 to 2019. She was one of the civic leaders of the Maidan Revolution of Dignity. She was elected to Parliament as from European Self-Reliance Party and then served as an independent MP. Since the start of Russian invasion of Ukraine, she, along with other activists, established the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. The center advocates for Ukrainian interests internationally and supports civil society actions for Ukraine's victory. We also have Casey Michel, who's an American author and journalist who covers illicit finance, kleptocracy, and developments in countries and regions formerly or currently occupied by the Russian and Soviet empires. He is the author of American Kleptocracy, and his writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, The Atlantic, and Washington Post, among other publications. He has a master's in Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies from Columbia University's Harriman Institute. Dr. Botakos Kasembekova is a lecturer in modern history at the University of Basel. She specializes in Russian and Soviet history, Stalinism, and post-Stalinism. She's the author of Disputed Cultures, Early Soviet Rule in Tajikistan, which traces Soviet imperial strategies in Central Asia, and she's a guest editor of the Stalinism in Central Asia, with Central Asian Survey. Her current research project deals with the post-Stalinist Soviet Union and analyzes how Soviet citizens unprocessed Stalinism in their private lives. Another book project titled Imperial Innocence traces major narrative tropes and imagery of Soviet imperialism. Dr. Erika Murat is an associate professor and chair of the Regional and Analytical Studies Department at the National Defense University. Dr. Murat research focuses on violence, mobilization, and security institutions in Eurasia, India, and Mexico. She has authored 3 books, including most recently The Politics of Police Reform, Society Against the State in Post-Soviet Countries. Her articles appeared in Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, EurasiaNet, and Open Democracy. Fatima Tlis is an investigative journalist, researcher, and expert on Russia. Ms. Tlis has covered Russia's brutal war in Chechnya, and for that, repeatedly and violently assaulted. She has traveled extensively in Russia and filed reports from Adige and Dagestan, among others. Like I said, this is an incredible panel. This is an incredible group of people who, in many ways, brought their writing and their conversation and their reporting has brought this issue of decolonizing Russia to the mainstream. This is why you're seeing this topic being discussed today. So we're going to open this up. We have many participants. I think this is pretty much a record for a Helsinki Commission briefing. So I'm not sure if Congressman Co-Chair Cohen joined us, and if he has, Congressman, would you like to offer your comments before we start? And if you're not on, that's totally fine. Just want to make sure that we give you an opportunity to do so. Okay, I'm not. Yes. Oh, okay. Sir, I think you're on.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm here somehow. My camera doesn't work or something else, but it's my fault. I just want to thank you for holding this briefing. You've got a great panel. It's an interesting topic, which I haven't really put together in my own mind as far as Russia's inconsistencies. They often criticize us for being inconsistent and having unique situations that may be distinct some of our foreign policy decisions and maybe some internal problems we've had over the years with civil rights, etc. But Russia certainly has issues where they have, in essence, colonized their own country. It's not a strict nation in the sense that we've known it in the past. And I've visited in a couple of the Caucasus that are certainly not treated like people from Moscow and St. Petersburg, which dominates. The Russian people dominate all these people. And we need to be concerned about the people in Tartarstan, in Baradia, and in the Far East and other areas, and to just show the inconsistency that Russia has. And it's not just what they want to do with Ukraine and Georgia and Chechnya. That's clear examples, but there are other examples where they have not been consistent. But I'm here to learn, and I thank you for holding the hearing, and I'm going to be listening, and thank all of our, and to Miss Fatima Talise, I see you're with us. You were up with us on a Russian propaganda hearing, and it just brings back the Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was with us that day, a heroic Russian citizen who has been incarcerated by the cruel and inhumane and typical autocratic attitudes of Putin. I don't know when Vladimir will get out of prison. I don't know if he'll get out of prison. But we must never forget Vladimir and always bring him up in conversation and speak for his freedoms, as well as Navalny, who's been sent off to a gulag. And we see what's going on in Russia. It's just crazy. But thank you for having the hearing. I'm here to listen.
Thank you so much, Co-Chair Cohen. Really appreciate your participation. Let us get started. First, Casey, let me ask you this question. I know you have remarks, but also within your remarks, if you could address this question. What is decolonizing anyway? I mean, why we're talking about it? Why it's so important? There's a war happening in Ukraine, and why are we talking about decolonizing Russia, the aggressor?
Sure. Yeah, Bhakti, I'd say, yeah, a great question. I mean, I will say at the outset, what an honor it is to be here with everyone today to be talking on this topic. I certainly don't think it could be timelier for any range of reasons. I mean, I certainly think at the outset, there's this ongoing confusion, some in good faith, some in bad faith, that the notion of decolonization, especially as it pertains to Russia, is simply a camouflage for dismemberment and partition, which it is absolutely not whatsoever, which is why I'm so happy we have voices like Erica and Baltikas and Hannah and Fatima here today to shine further light on the notion and topic and broader history of discourse surrounding decolonization, perhaps lack thereof, as it pertains to Russia in and of itself. Bhakti, I guess I'm wondering, should I just dive right into these opening comments right here as we begin this conversation? Which, again, I should say, I know we talked about this off mic, which will hopefully be the first of far more to come, whether it's briefings or hearings moving forward. I guess I want to just outline on my end, speaking as an American, the broader history of U.S. policy, or perhaps lack thereof, as it pertains to the kinds of indigenous and anti-colonial movements within Russia. I know Representative Cohen just outlined some of the non-Russian nations that are still considered part of Russia proper. These are colonized nations. that we consider to be part of Russia proper, even though, again, these are non-Russian nations themselves that remain colonized by, as we've seen yet again, another dictatorship in the Kremlin. So to start, I'm going to go back a few decades to the actually early 1990s. I'm not going to go through the entire history of Russian expansionism and imperialism. I'm sure we'll get to more of that in this conversation today. But I want to actually start in 1991 as the Soviet Union itself began its final hurdle toward collapse and disintegration. While this was taking place, the U.S., as the historical record makes very clear, was very much caught off guard. The George H.W. Bush administration spent months during that year trying to find some kind of new strategy as it pertains to what was then this splintering superpower in the Soviet Union. And the course that Washington ended up choosing was simple. It chose to prioritize relations with Moscow and prevent the disintegration of the Soviet Empire and eventually Russia from going too far. And that meant in many cases simply sitting on our hands. Instead of offering diplomatic or even material support to new countries, new nations, declaring independence, declaring sovereignty from Moscow's empire, the U.S. actively worked to prevent certain pro-sovereignty movements from succeeding. Think of Bush's infamous Chicken Kiev speech in 1991, where he publicly criticized Ukrainian separatists for trying to break away from Moscow, which unfortunately has not aged very well whatsoever. And there was a logic to all of this. After all, this was a country in the Soviet Union that was a country with a significant nuclear arsenal. And no one wanted that arsenal to fall into the wrong hands. And the West, and the US especially, perhaps understandably, thought at the time that so long as Russia transitioned into a market economy and held free and fair elections, that actual borders and boundaries wouldn't necessarily matter quite so much. And again, you can see the logic to this argument. This was all taking place amidst a far broader ignorance in the West, and again, especially in the United States of America, of the history of Russian imperialism and Russian colonization writ large, and of understanding that Russia continues to oversee what is in many ways a traditional European empire, only that instead of colonizing nations and peoples overseas, it instead colonized nations and peoples over land. That is to say, Russia didn't create a transoceanic empire of colonized nations, but a transcontinental empire of colonized nations. Now, in the 1990s, the trade-off was clear. Instead of backing these independence and pro-sovereignty movements rising up against imperialists in Moscow, the U.S. either dragged its feet or willingly turned a blind eye to these movements. And this wasn't just the case in places like Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova or Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or Azerbaijan. That goes also for the colonized nations that are still considered part of Russia proper. Because in the early 1990s, so many of these nations also pushed for increased sovereignty, in some cases even outright independence. These are nations like Chechnya, which had clear majority support for independence in the early 1990s and yet received no support whatsoever from the West, even though the West could likely have stopped the violence and result in tens of thousands of deaths that came from the Chechen wars. It goes for nations like Tatarstan, which Representative Cohen just mentioned, which was first colonized by Russia centuries ago, but which in the early 1990s clearly voted for equal footing with Russia itself, and again received no help whatsoever from the West. Over and over and over again, these indigenous and colonized nations pushed for sovereignty in the 1990s, and again, the West placed all of its hopes on a market economy, on democratic norms, changing Russia, changing the Kremlin to such an extent, preventing a return to the kind of Russian imperialism we see now, that these anti-colonial movements wouldn't end up mattering. This was administration after administration in the US that pursued this policy. It happened year after year, decade after decade. And 30 years later, from the vantage point of here we are in 2022, it is as clear as day that that policy has failed. Bhakti, as you mentioned, Ukraine is the latest manifestation of this failure, but it will not be the last. And the reason is simple. Russia remains the only European empire that has never come close to fully decolonizing. It's the only European country that hasn't come anywhere close to fully reckoning with its colonial history. That reckoning is coming regardless of what the West does. It may come in 5 years, it may come in a decade, it and maybe as soon as next year when Russia's economy begins to accelerate toward outright depression. Regardless of when it happens, the West, and especially the US, has to be ready, because the West was not ready in 1991 when it did all that it could to try to keep the Russian Federation patched together, and then turned a blind eye when the Kremlin began smothering these anti-colonial movements and recreating dictatorship in Moscow. And now, as Putin threatens nuclear war, all in the service of, again, extending and expanding and entrenching Russian empire, choosing to ignore the kinds of anti-colonial, pro-sovereignty, and anti-imperial movements that will emerge in Russia is a luxury we no longer have. And that means we need to begin fleshing out related policy on this, and soon. Everything from supporting democratic federalism in Russia to simply recognizing Russia as a European empire that has never fully decolonized, and beginning to be ready for these anti-colonial movements when they begin emerging. Because after this war that Russia has unleashed, there's no going back to the status quo ante. And that goes for Russia itself. And we cannot afford to make the same mistakes that we did 30 years ago, because otherwise we're just going to end up in the exact same place that we are today. I'll stop there.
Casey, tremendously helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you for laying out the framework and explaining why and what is happening, and that this understanding that Russia is a colonial and imperial power that is just not there. So let me ask you this, Dr. Kassambekova. Your writing is incredible. I mean, some of the stuff that you've written that I've read, it's just truly explains the extent of this internalizing this colonial kind of subjugation among the peoples of the Soviet Union and even before that. Let me ask you this: why do you think there's this? I know you have your prepared remarks, but if you could address this question of why is it that people inside and outside of Russia have such a tremendous time acknowledging that Russia was a colonial power, and that it has really subjugated all these peoples, and that you don't get to be a country of this size without being a colonial power? Why is there such a reluctance to admit that?
Well, Russ, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for this question. Well, the book that I co-author right now with another historian, we argue that it has to do something with kind of the narrative that the Soviet Union created, and that is the narrative of imperial innocence. The Soviet Union blamed the West, and it's only Western empires that were colonial, but the Soviet Union was a liberating force. And because this idea, this narrative was very attractive, especially in the global South, this propaganda was allowed to oversee the colonial dimensions of the Soviet Union. So it has to do with the narrative, and it has to do with this kind of idea that only capitalism, the whole idea also has to do with kind of the Marxian idea that was popular all around the world, that capitalism produces colonialism, whereas socialism liberates. However, historical work that has done a great job to uncover the colonial nature of the Soviet Union, unfortunately, it has not gone into the mainstream. But now I think it is quite clear the continuities that we have from the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the post-Soviet. This is something that, despite kind of the economic system, we have the same dimensions. But so European decolonization in the aftermath of the Second World War made the world a more just, more democratic and safe place. Today, nobody questions the rightness of the French, British, or German decolonization. The Soviet Union was the largest land empire here of the Russian colonial empire, which only partially underwent decolonization. The Soviet Union was based on military occupation, systemic crimes against humanity and genocides, forced Russification, and elimination of the understanding of individual rights and dignity of people. And this has been, for historians, this is nothing new. Today, Russia attempts to restore the Soviet Empire based on the idea of Russian cultural superiority and genocidal suppression of peoples. And so decolonization decolonization of Russia would mean, I think, first of all, with the recognition of the imperial and brutal nature of the Soviet Union and the contemporary Russian ambitions. Well, secondly, with setting up justice and reconciliation committees to account for past and current atrocities to restore the dignity of the colonized, such as accepting the past genocides as genocides. For example, the 1944 deportation of the entire Chechen people was recognized as genocide by the European Parliament already in 2004, but we need a larger recognition and awareness of this and other atrocities. It also means decentering Russia as the main player in the former Soviet space by supporting civic initiatives and civil societies of its neighbors and within Russia. Civil societies and the civic spirit based on the political understanding of a nation, as the case of Ukraine has shown again in 2022, is a key precondition for the struggle for decolonial freedom and justice. Moreover, since civil societies are based on debates and therefore advance plurality, tolerance, and respect of human rights, they tend to successfully deal with the issues of overcoming colonial legacies and fostering reconciliation. Decolonizing Russia will mean a safer and more democratic world in Eurasia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this is a great transition from laying out the framework, understanding why and how, and I think your point about, Soviet Union using propaganda to explain, no, what we're doing here is actually, liberating these people and not colonizing, while they were actually doing the opposite. I think this explains a lot about the reluctance and sort of confusion, I think, among many people who say, wait, why is Russia colonial power, right? Why do we need to decolonize? So I think this is incredible. Dr. Marat, let me ask you this: how does all of this translate into what Russia is doing today? In Ukraine, it's pretty obvious what's going on. It's a war. It's a colonial, neo-colonial, whatever you want to call it. It's a war that is happening just to subjugate a people, to be able to control territory and a people and a culture and everything else. Beyond Ukraine, what are some of the other places that Russia, maybe not so explicitly, maybe a little bit more implicitly, a little bit more subtly, is continuing these policies? And are there threats to other parts of the former Soviet Union or beyond?
Thank you, Bhakti, and thank you, Helsinki Commission, for organizing this discussion today, the briefing. Really important and really, important discussion. I'm speaking to you from Bishkek, my native city of Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, and my views today are mine. They don't represent National Defense University, DoD, or U.S. government. So yes, the war in Ukraine is the worst expression of Russia's imperial ambition today and Russia's efforts to restore the Soviet regime, Soviet Union, and restore the territories of the Soviet Union. But of course, that's not the only aggressive political action that Russia and Putin are currently perpetrating on the territories that were previously occupied by the Soviet regime. There is, of course, there's the war, the occupied territories in Georgia, in Moldova. There is constant nationalistic, aggressive language against Kazakhstan and against other countries, again, that were formerly under the Soviet control. So with that, I'd like to start reading my briefing for my notes for today. So while Putin is trying to restore the Soviet Union by invading Ukraine and intimidating other countries in the region, Russia's neighbors, so Central Asia, the South Caucasus, and Eastern European countries, are undergoing a decolonial awakening of their own. The war in Ukraine is prompting a deeper re-examination of the meaning and legacies of the Soviet regime. Many in Eurasia now realize that Russia may have never pursued true equality with its neighbors, not now, not a century ago when the Soviet Empire was established. The genocidal war in Ukraine reminds of the way the Bolsheviks conquered Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia through genocidal violence, starvation, and cultural erasure. Difficult discussions about the current role of Russia in the region are taking place as well. Several governments surrounding Russia, in countries surrounding Russia, have shown greater independence from Moscow than previously expected. Just a few days ago, in a televised meeting with Putin, President of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, said that his country can't recognize Lugansk and Donbass as separate from Ukraine. Former Foreign Minister of Uzbekistan, Kamilov, also stated that his country supports Ukraine's territorial integrity. Time is thus not on the side of Putin's imperialistic crusade to reassert Russia's exclusive control over its neighboring countries. Nations formerly occupied by the Soviets expect Kremlin's full recognition of their sovereignty, that Kremlin stops demanding political loyalty, stops imposing the Russian language and Russian cultural dominance, and stops interfering with their foreign policy. The war in Ukraine has accelerated the process of breaking out of Moscow's orbit and abandoning loyalty to Putin's regime. Russia is becoming just another neighbor, not a historical ally, a neighbor that is dangerous in the eyes of Kazakhs, Georgians, Moldovans, and Kyrgyz. Separation from Russia does not always mean that these countries will seek closer alignment with the West, but it is the right moment for the West to support the colonial discussion of Russia's imperial ambitions, both on the territories formerly occupied by the Soviet Russia and inside Russia. Only by examining and abandoning its centuries-long imperial identity can Russia remain a relevant political actor in the region and maintain friendly relations with its neighbors and the West. And hopefully, we will continue discussions like this and include more people also from Russia, not just from countries that were formerly under the Soviet control. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marat. I think you've pointed out something that is absolutely critical to understand, that time is not on Putin's side. And I think having these conversations and talking about these issues is just elevating this issue to a point where many people recognize that hopefully will shorten that timeline so there's less damage that Russia can do to its neighbors, and frankly to its own people as well. Before we move on to the next witness, I would like to point out to all of our participants that we have a question box. So we're going to have a Q&A session in a little bit. So whatever questions you have, just write it in. I will see those and I will take those questions and address to our witnesses. So Hannah, let me ask you this. First of all, thank you for doing this. I know you are in between airports. Hannah just told us she missed, the plane was late, so it looks like you're in a cab going from one airport to another. So thank you for taking the time to do this. But let me ask you a very basic question that I think is very apparent to everyone who is speaking today, but does not seem to be apparent to everybody else. Is Russia's war against Ukraine in any way, shape, or form justified, and is anything but a colonial projection of power? What is it? Why is Russia doing this, and what is Ukraine doing in response?
Thank you, Bakhtia. Thank you, Helsinki Commission, for organizing this very brave and I think very strategic event today. Because just last week when I went and I were in Vishwanka, and the taxi driver asked me, "Are you from Ukraine?" I say, "Yes, I'm from Ukraine. I'm Ukrainian. Could you please tell me why Russians are fighting with you?"
Hannah, may I ask you to maybe switch off your video feed? Because, Hannah, if I may ask you to switch off maybe your video feed because you're breaking up. I think maybe it's going to be tokens. Yeah, thank you so much. Hannah, I think we might have. Hannah, maybe I'm going to go to Fatima for a second, and then we're going to come back to you because you're breaking up. We're going to come back. Oh, I'm sorry. Again, I do apologize. Like I said, Hannah is in between airports, and she was here last week. Some of us had an opportunity.
No, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Now it's so much better. Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Sorry. So So Russia has a long and horrific tradition going back centuries of attempting to eliminate Ukrainian nation by destroying Ukraine's national culture, linguistic, and historic identity. Moscow did it during Tsarist imperial times and during Soviet times, and just in 20th century, Moscow.
Hannah, I do apologize. You're breaking up. Maybe let me try you in a few minutes.
To erase Ukrainians from existence by Holodomor genocide, and they are all a hunger threat Middle East Asia. So
Hannah, let us try to come back to you in a second. But Fatima, let me ask you this question. I do apologize to everyone. Like I said, it's trying to make this work in this complex world. Fatima, let me ask you this. I think we've talked a lot about Russian colonial policies and their impact abroad, but beyond Russia. But can you talk to us? And you are an expert on this. A little bit about what kind of an impact, or what is Russia doing to its own native peoples? Again, Russia it's not just one ethnicity. There are many peoples and many nationalities and ethnic groups. What does Russia's colonial policies at home, what do they look like, and what is their impact on Russia's peoples, non-majority ethnic peoples?
Thank you. First, let me start with thanking Representative Cohen, the staff of Helsinki Commission, and distinguished colleagues for this panel. I have to say first that I'm speaking today in my personal capacity and expressing my own views, which do not represent those of Voice of America or the United States government. And more importantly, I'm honored to speak on behalf of millions of my fellow Circassians, those living in forced exile and those suffering under the Russian occupation in the homeland. We call our homeland Khaku, which means the middle of the sea. Today, the Commission has given voice to those Russia has been trying so hard to mute forever. And there is a reason to why Russia wants to silence Circassia, to erase the country and the people from the existence. That is because Russia, more than anybody else, knows it has committed genocide against Circassians. Those crimes against humanity are documented in the handwritten testimonies of Russia's own Tsars, military commanders, top policymakers, the evidence preserved in the imperial archives in St. Petersburg, Russia, in Helsinki, Finland, in Tbilisi, Georgia. It is based on the examination of those Russian documents that the Georgian parliament recognized in 2011 the Circassian genocide perpetrated by Russia. Today's stories from Ukraine are those of ethnic cleansing, mass murder of civilians, destruction of entire cities and villages, forced deportations, filtration camps, mass abduction of children, forced Russification, appropriation of culture and historic revisionism, everything the United Nations defines as crime against humanity, genocide. In the face of such senseless brutality, many wonder what Russia's endgame is. The answer to that question is Circassia. Just like Ukraine, Circassia was a vibrant, prosperous nation centuries before Muscovy existed. Circassians converted to Christianity before Russia existed. Circassian nobility was embedded in the Kievan Rus from its very early stages. Seeking to strengthen his grip on power, the Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible married the Circassian Princess Maria. So where is Circassia today? It is not on the world map or even in the history book. Circassia fought against Russia for more than 100 years. It never surrendered. Russia won and occupied Circassia by killing and forcibly deporting an estimated 98% of the Circassian population. But the genocide of Circassians did not end with Russia declaring a victory more than a century ago. The Kremlin divided Circassia into 3 administrative entities and Circassians into multiple ethnic minority groups, giving each different names and even different languages. The Circassian kids in Russia don't study their history or their language or culture at schools. Today, Russia denies the Circassians their indigenous status, their political, economical, cultural, ecological, and linguistic rights. To the millions of Circassians living in a forced exile in more than 50 countries around the world, Russia denies the right for repatriation, instead imposing visa limitations, quotas specifically designed for the Circassians, regardless of who occupies the Kremlin at any given era, be that a Tsar, a communist, or a Chekist. The Circassians know firsthand that the core of the regime's policy towards Circassians is constant, and that is a colonial policy of systematic and selective destruction of the identity, and that also goes for other, what Russia calls ethnic minorities. Vladimir Putin made it clear twice. His role models are 2 Russian emperors known for the most aggressive, brutal, and bloody state-building strategies, and that his mission is to rebuild that empire at any cost. His appetites, as we see with Ukraine, are only growing. I just wanted to underline, I'm not a policymaker, I'm not a political analyst. I'm not going to suggest any measures to be taken to improve the situation, to prevent Russia from, being emboldened even further than it is now. I'm presenting a case of my people. I hope this helps to understand the root of brutality and Russian colonialism and why this needs to be changed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Liz. I mean, this is, I think, again, it's historical perspective is very important. Context may be different, but I think the reality that you've laid out just shows the brutality of the policies and how basically a people and nation can just cease to exist because of these policies. So again, this is not to suggest that that's what's going to happen, but I think it's a good reminder. And I think this is, again, to everyone who's still debating, and I don't want to use the word apologist, but apologizing or sort of trying to apologize themselves, or trying to excuse Russia from some of the things that they're doing. That it's important for them to understand this has been history of Russian Empire. This is not Russophobic. This is not anti-Russian. This is not anti any ethnicity, but this is just a statement of a fact. Hannah, let me try to go back to you and see if you may be able to join us. I think the best thing to do maybe not do your video stream, because maybe that's what's preventing us from hearing you. Let's try to do it again. Hannah? I'm not sure. Sometimes, yeah. All right. Let me Paul, I think you've raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Hey, everybody. Wonderful panel here. I'm here with my colleague, Rachel Bellman. Just really, really terrific. I guess it strikes me that this incredible discussion isn't a part of mainstream DC policy discussions. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we wanted to have it, because it doesn't seem to echo. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And we could get into those reasons. But one very big reason that often comes up, because, and Putin never lets us forget it, is the Russian Federation's possession of nuclear weapons, which is constantly this, oh, well, don't try us or anything like that. How how can we talk about this while taking into consideration these kinds of, you know, I guess, large scale, realist grand strategy concerns that seem to almost entirely trump the discussion and shut down any discussion of this?
Who would like to take this question? Casey, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just
Anyone, feel free to
just
jump in.
a quick response to that, Paul. I mean, one of the things that I talked about at the beginning was lessons from the 1990s, lessons missed, lessons forgotten, and lessons learned. And one of the very clear successes, arguably the clearest success, at least as it pertains to American policy, was, and this is a far broader story that's beyond the scope of the discussion today, was the management of the former, well, I guess former Soviet nuclear arsenal, and what to do with those elements that were in a range of different countries that were emerging from the Soviet collapse. So there's a very clear kind of muscle memory from that moment in and of itself, which is, I suppose, another way of saying we've already experienced, as it pertains to the dissolution of a nuclear power that 30 years ago in the Soviet Union. There's another potential for that moving forward with things like Irish reunification in the United Kingdom moving forward. That's another nuclear power that may see some certain territorial shifts pertaining to directly the history of colonization or lack thereof on the island of Ireland. That is to say, there are lessons aplenty for that moving forward. It's one element of further discussion and discourse to kind of work around this, what you described, Paul, as this kind of barrier that seems to have appeared or emerged that blocks this discourse around decolonization in Russia, if only because of the nuclear arsenal it maintains.
Thank you so much, Casey. Dr. Murad, and then Hannah, I see you're back on, but let's try to do it again after Dr. Murad's answer to this question.
Back to
Okay.
why are we not discussing Russia from a decolonial perspective? Since it looks so obvious now, why hasn't it been happening for a while now? Well, I think the answer is not necessarily the nuclear or military might of Russia or any other hard security issues, to be honest. It's really about knowledge production, the structure of knowledge production, how Western academic and policy communities really believe, and I'm afraid continue to believe, that Russia brought modernization, electrification, development to its colonial subjects. And that, and now I would like to emphasize that I'm citing a lot of what Bota has been writing about, Bota Kassimbekova, that since we see all those roads and plantations, cotton plantations in Central Asia or in the Caucasus or in Ukraine, Soviet Union must have been a good empire or a good force for the people. I let Bota to continue on this argument on why we don't see Russia as a colonial power. I'd like to just add that I really appreciate spaces like this when you can hear voices not necessarily from Western academia, but actually the very people who lived under the Soviet regime and who had the time to process honestly the trauma of living under an imperial master. So thank you so much for holding this forum and hearing the voices that have not been heard before.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murad. Hannah, we're going to go to you, but I just want to again to emphasize we have a chat box. Any questions you guys have, please, anyone in the audience, please feel free to write those questions, and we will shortly start the Q&A session. Hannah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me today. Actually, from Peter the Great, then Soviet Union, now Russia with genocidal war against Ukraine, we have to learn lessons. And please not to be afraid of strategically approaching the great approach and how to change not just regime, but how to change the imperialistic nature of Russian statehood. Because instead of seeing some, how to say, don't humiliate Putin, or let's negotiate some peace talks, what we've seen with him within 8 years of ongoing Russian aggression, in return, we received what? We received genocide.
I know. We lost you again. But we understand what you're saying. And I think you made the most important point. I mean, that got through. That's the important bit got through. While we're waiting for Hannah, Co-Chair Cohen, I just wanted to make sure that we gave you an opportunity to ask any questions, if you have any, to our distinguished panel here.
I don't think I have any questions. I appreciate it. I've learned a lot,
to
and
help
I understand
wrap
the inconsistencies in Russia's position. It's obvious it's a federation that they've colonized, and they're not free. This is, and what's going on in Ukraine is just an extension of their imperial, from Peter the Great attitude that Putin has picked up with a that it really never has had much of a lapse. I mean, they've always, with Soviet Union, et cetera, it's been they've taken over other nations and people and tried to, and they subjugated them to Moscow and St. Petersburg. But thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Congressman. Appreciate your comments. Dr. Kasambeko, I think you had your hand raised.
Yes, I just wanted to add that decolonization is about listening. As Erica Marat already mentioned, it's about listening to voices that one doesn't want to hear. And imperialism is about shutting those voices and not listening to people. So what we have is that why we never considered the Soviet Union as a colonial empire is that, first of all, this kind of very successful anti-Western narrative of the Soviet Union that colonialism is a Western problem, that was very successful. Secondly, lack of knowledge. For example, when we talk about Holodomor, when we talk about hungers and genocides, these were forbidden topics in the Soviet Union. So, for example, when Kazakh scholars or students try to find out information about it, they were arrested and they were repressed. So some committed suicides because so it was impossible. We have a very short period of time in the 1990s when archives were open, but that was a very short period of time, and we're still, archives are in Moscow. We don't have access to our history, so we don't have a lot of proofs to go and prove our history. Second, and very importantly, in the West, most of the voices were given to Russian scholars, and Russian scholars are not interested in that story. So even like scholars from Central Asia, scholars from Eastern Europe, we also have historical academic debates and struggles as well, because we are underrepresented. Our voices are not heard in the West. It's a very lonely struggle. That moment is amplifying a bit of our voices, but this is kind of academic structural hierarchies that privilege Russian voices is also a very important problem. This is something that I would like to say. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. That's a fantastic point. And with that, let me transition to a Q&A session. I want to make a couple of things very clear to our panel, but also to the participants, to the audience. There are a lot of questions. Some of them are incredibly, I would not even call them R-rated. It's like NC-17. So I think you can just tell that this is generating a lot of interest, to say it politely. Some of the questions are, I'll try to kind of distill them into an actual question. Some of these are not distillable at all, but let me, I think this is an important question. I think this is something that I'm getting a sense there are multiple questions that are similar to this one. So the question from, and I understand actually our staff told us that there were people from a handful of Russian universities joining us today. So welcome to everyone, but I'm hoping for a good conversation here. So should somebody from Anton, he says, so should every state that has ever subjugated other grant them independence if they ask for it? Or is it just about Russia because of the way it has subjugated other nations? Can you clarify the difference, because it can be the point of more arguments? I think it's a valid point, right? Why are we talking about Russia specifically? And can maybe Dr. Murad, you could take it, and then anyone please jump in.
Sure, I'll try. I think the answer is pretty simple. Yes, there were a lot of evil empires out there, and every empire embarked on genocidal warfare and erased cultures in peoples and so on, and extracted resources. That's all right. And here, United States also as a settler colonial empire. Same with European countries, some Asian countries. China is one. But the key difference is the discussions are happening in Western countries or in other parts of the world on the repercussions of this imperial advancement on territories of indigenous and native peoples. Those discussions are difficult. They're emotional. They generate a lot of tensions in societies, but they are important and they do take place. Unfortunately, Russia maintains what labeled imperial innocence, that Russia is not an empire, that Russia's advancement into neighboring territories was a gift to those countries. Somehow Russian culture is so great that the people that Russia occupied need to be thankful to the imperial master. And these kind of discussions are happening outside of Russia in the territories where Soviets previously ruled, but these discussions are not happening in Russia, and they're unfortunately just now picking up in the West as well. And we really need to reprocess. We need to understand. We need to look at the Soviet legacy from the perspective of the people who were colonized, and not from the Russian perspective, and not from the Western perspective.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murat. There's another side to this question, and I'm gonna actually just read it as is, just because I think, in case I think you would be a perfect person to take this, because you actually have been very critical of some of the U.S. policies, frankly, and you've written extensively about Japanese internment in the United States, and I think this is a critical question, but I think it's an important question. So, marveling at the spectacle of the U.S. government founded upon genocide without parallel in human history, and sitting upon internal colonies of the remains of that genocide, and the descendants of slaves with perhaps 1,000 military bases occupying the bulk of the planet and conducting a war on Russia's borders, holding this discussion. And it's a Don DeBar, and if you would like a response to this, do we have a moral authority to be even talking about this, Casey?
Well, I don't know about the question of moral authority insofar as we have moral authority to talk about any topic under the sun, but I think it's incredibly important to, again, as Dr. Murat, Dr. Kazanbekova mentioned, elevate the voices that have been silenced for so long, certainly as it pertains to Russian colonization and lack of decolonization these days. One of the things that I'm most, and perhaps this isn't the right form to talk about this, or the right framing for this, but excited about moving forward about conversations like this, is that this is going to spark so many further conversations, not just in Russia, not just in regions and territories occupied either formerly or currently by the Russian Empire itself, but even the discourse in the United States in and of itself. And I couldn't help but think, during this entire conversation today of the role that of all things, the Cold War played in framing and accelerating civil rights discourse in the United States of America in the 1950s and in the 1960s. I think there's still an underappreciated element of just how it is that international pressure shining a light on the lack of civil liberties from minorities in the United States in the mid-20th century, and in many cases still today, played in accelerating the expansion of civil rights, of voting rights, of civil liberties in the U.S. And this is, again, a conversation for another time. I know Dr. Murat was just talking about the lack of discourse internally in Russia in decolonization, or the broader decolonization discourse. It's only in recent years that in the academic space in the United States of America, we have seen finally this kind of watershed moment of approaching, attracting, identifying, analyzing American imperial conquest in North America, to say nothing of broader American imperial conquest elsewhere. And there have been, an unprecedented raft of publications and analyses, some of which I have sitting behind me here today, as it pertains to American indigenous relations, American indigenous colonization, of the hundreds of indigenous nations that continue to comprise, and in many cases are still growing, in what we consider to be what we describe as United States of America. This is only going to continue. One of the reasons I'm so, use the term, excited about where that discourse is going to go is I know it's going to redound in the United States of America to force Americans to approach, to identify, to understand America's own imperial history. Because at the end of the day, there are far more similarities than there are differences as it pertains to 19th century expansionism from Moscow and St. Petersburg eastward, from Washington and the eastern seaboard in North America westward. It's going to take decades, frankly, it's going to take centuries, but I do think that that question hits on an important comment. Again, I'm not going to talk about moral authority one way or the other, but the more voices that have been silenced for years and years that we can elevate, the better off we're all going to be in the long run.
Thank you so much, Casey. Fatima, I think you had a response to this question, or maybe you had a comment on a previous one, and then Dr. Kasembekova.
Yes, I do have a response to this question. My response is I absolutely have a moral authority to talk about this topic. I'm a Circassian. How much talk you hear in the United States about slavery? How much effort is done by the United States people to start helping people who suffered slavery to start healing, to rectify the situation? Did you ever hear anything like that in Russia? Now, please go Google white slavery. The first word which is gonna come up is Circassians. The Circassians were sold in thousands on the slave markets in the Ottoman Empire by Russia. If you go and see the biography of some famous people, including the mayor of London, the former mayor of London, now Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, his great-grandmother was a Circassian slave. Who talks in Russia about rectifying the trauma of the Circassian slavery? Who talks about the guilt of Russian state before the Circassian people? Nobody. That's not just the absence of discussion. It's a specifically designed strategy to silence this discussion, to make sure it doesn't exist. That's a colonial strategy. As for your question, everybody who has ever dealt with the Russian disinformation and propaganda would immediately recognize it for what it is. It's called, there's actually a professional term for it in disinformation, whatablism. No matter what each country's position or past is, it doesn't eliminate the other country's problems. Neither does it answer it. Neither does give anybody a higher moral ground to question somebody else. But this situation is as it is, and I'm representing the people who suffered and still are suffering from Russian imperial policies. I hope this answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bliss. This is, I think, a really good answer to that question. Mr. Kasembekova, I think you had a comment as well.
Yes, very
Kasembekova.
quickly. Yes. So very quickly on the question with the US, again, I agree that this is kind of a very typical way of blaming the West rather than looking inwards. But at the same time, I co-authored the book Imperial Innocence with an excellent historian, Kimberly St. Julian Vernon from the United States, who comes also from looking at the history of Black Americans, and she recognizes a lot of the things that are happening in the United States. So this comparative perspective that we will have clearly shows that one can, that one doesn't have to have slavery to have colonialism. This is the first point. The second point, I think what we need to look at decolonization, and I recently realized that there is imperial understanding of decolonization, and that imperial colonial understanding of decolonization is, divide and rule, ethnic violence, strife, disempowerment. However, the decolonial understanding of decolonization is dignity, human rights, self-determination, political rights. So if we look at not from the kind of colonial understanding of decolonization, but the decolonial understanding of decolonization, it's a chance. It's a chance for everyone. It's a chance for all the peoples in Eurasia. It's a chance for reconciliation. It's a chance for truth. It's a chance for democratic involved, political system. I've spent many years in Germany, and so Germany has been looking at its very difficult past. And can you imagine, Germany would not want to go to these decolonial debates about themselves, and they would just say, the Americans or, the British were worse. That doesn't work. And decolonization in Germany has meant equality, inclusivity, tolerance, democracy. And decolonization, we need to look as a chance. It's a very difficult story. Stalinism and decolonization are not separate. Without decolonization, we'll never have de-Stalinization. We'll never be able, without looking at the imperial dimensions of Soviet dictatorship, we will never be able to work through this Soviet dictatorship. So, and this is a chance for Russians, this is the chance for all of us to build a better future. And what we want is simply to be heard and to be respected. This is an equality, something that was propagated as something that the Soviet Union wanted to install and never did, because, for example, Central Asians had never had a political voice in all of the decisions that were taking place. So this is something that is good. This is something that will build and will be able to a peaceful and respectful coexistence. We need to see it as a good process, as something that is very positive.
Thank you so much. I genuinely, as an eternal optimist myself, I appreciate this positive, look at it. And I think this is the truth of it. This is not an effort to hurt anyone. This is not a truth to be. Again, I see some of the comments to be Russophobic, to anti-Russian or anything like that. This is an effort to genuinely understand what is driving Russia, but also do something, have a conversation that's going to be good for neighbors, Russia's neighbors, but also for Russians themselves. And let me, Dr. Kazimekova, you've talked about it before, before we do that, we're actually out of time, but if everyone is available for maybe another 10 minutes, just because we have such a flood of questions, if everyone is available, we're just going to extend it for maybe another 10 minutes, and we're going to finish at 11:15. If it's okay with everyone. Also, Hannah unfortunately couldn't join. We will share her statement with everyone who's interested. It's going to be on our website as well, so please feel free to check up on that. But I think you've touched upon it indirectly, but let me ask you this. So one of the, Branko is asking, what about the great risks involved in pushing to break up Russia as it exists now? Are we pushing, is decolonizing breaking up Russia? Does it equal to that? Is one, decolonizing is breaking up Russia? And if so, are there any risks associated with that? Dr. Kast,
yes,
Dr.
yes. So if we look, just a comparison, if we look at Germany and Poland, which share this kind of colonial history in the past, kind of decolonization brought only equality on an equal basis. They are part of the European Union. So if polities work with each other on equal standing, they can cooperate with each other on equal standing when both of the polities have equal rights. So it's not about collapse, and it's not about demise. It's about giving rights and equal standing in a conversation and in coexistence. So to say that, British Empire should have never been broken because it's all about demise, or for the French, or the Nazi Germany for that matter, it's something that will provide everyone dignity, rights, and it's about, coexistence. So one really needs to look at it. It's a chance for everyone. It's a chance for Russians, and it's a chance for all other people who suffer from dictatorships. And the only way to really deal with imperial dictatorship is really to talk about rights and dignity and voices.
Thank you so much. Let me ask you one more question, and maybe Dr. Murad and Ms. Bliss, maybe you could answer this question. And this is from Kirill, and he asks, what about voices of minorities within the ethnic regions of Russia? So the point being that, there are, for example, the Marathi people in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan who are under unwilling Tatarization during the relatively free time. I think we miss that colonialism is multi-layered, and colonized groups can also engage in colonizing activities within their territory. Is that true? And what do we do about this, right? I mean, we're talking about ethnic groups, we're talking about people who are being colonized, but they themselves apparently, seemingly engaging in colonizing. Is that an important dynamic to keep in mind when we're talking about Russia? And is, Russia, the big federal Russia, actually helping those tiny minority groups to maintain their identity?
So we absolutely need to hear voices from all across Russia. So far, the dominant discourse about Russia it comes out from Moscow and St. Petersburg, and not from other parts of Russia. On collaborators, imperial collaborators, they always existed, no matter in what imperial reality, what geographical context. There has always been collaborators. It's a way of survival, a source of power. But these kind of these are the distractions. They allow colonizers to pretend as if this was that their actions are legitimate and acceptable and even welcomed in the colonized nations. Ramzan Kadyrov is an example of such collaborator who found an enormous source of an enormous power for himself by collaborating with Kremlin. And in any colonized society, nation, group, you'll always find someone who will exist in between the colonized and the colonizer. And it's a normal thing, and we shouldn't be distracted by that.
Thank you so much. Ms. Liz, I wonder if you might have some comments on that.
A few days ago, I read a commentary, an interview with Christopher Steele. He's a famous British spy who wrote this Trump dossier. So anyways, that was about the situation in Russia, and he was asked, why does he think that the Russians, the population in Russia condone Putin's violent actions in Ukraine? And his answer just, struck me because it let me understand that he does really know Russia. So his answer was, because people, I'm not quoting directly, it's just a paraphrase of his words, but the core of it was that the Russian government has brutalized people to the point when the people became brutal themselves. That's what's going on in Russia, and that's why we see so many non-Russians being sent to Ukraine, killing and dying themselves and committing atrocities. As for the multiplying the colonial powers on the horizontal level, on the local level, that's pretty much a classic Kremlin divide and rule policy, part of it. For instance, in one of the republic, they simply promote and support, of course, to the certain extent, one of the ethnic groups while they oppress the other one. And by doing that, they simply pull the strings. They keep the situation under control. That's how it works. And I've seen this, I've experienced this, I lived through this in Russia. So if Adygea, for instance, one of the Circassian republics, declares the Circassian language as a state language, Russian prosecutors force Adygea to change the constitution, and the local Russians who actually are happy to study the Circassian language because they live in there, are brainwashed into believing that they are forced to use the Circassian. I mean, we live in Russia and we all speak Russians, not by choice. I cut the OVA end of my last name because nobody asked me when they put that, at the end of my last name. My Circassian last name is Tlis. It means hot blood. In Russian, it's Tlisova. Who asked me when they changed that? They changed our topography, the names of our cities, our own names. That's what you call, ethnic targeting of the people. Thank you. I hope this answered your question.
Ms. Bliss, I mean, you already had an amazingly cool last name, but not knowing that it means hot blood makes it even cooler. So congratulations on a really cool last name. Maybe one more question and then any final comments, and then we can maybe wrap this up. But this has been an incredible discussion. Like I said, the engagement's been through the roof, and I'm hoping maybe we're going to do one of these down the line too. And this is for Mariam Hayat, and I think this is an interesting and important question. Just to see sort of a through line, how do you interpret Russia's presence in Syria and its continued endorsement of the Assad regime? Is this connected to Russia's expansionist agenda? And if I may add to that, is there a connection between what Russia is doing in Syria, Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova? Is there a connection there? Maybe Casey, and then anyone else, please jump in.
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Russian activities in Syria. I haven't written extensively on that. I can only comment kind of from the broader 10,000-foot view. My sense is that there's less, certainly ethno-nationalistic or I don't know, imperialistic discourse around intervention in Syria. You know, the term that comes to mind is державность, right? Greatness, great powerness, and hard, I suppose, realism that is lacking in the Ukrainian context and the Ukrainian invasion. I do think future scholars will have a field day examining the similarities and especially differences and discrepancies between Russia's intervention in Syria and invasion of Ukraine. But I do think there is fertile ground for examining and then extracting that much further the role of imperialism, the role of colonization in Russia's invasion in Ukraine moving forward.
Fatima, please. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. So since the time of the Soviet Union, Russia has been maintaining what is called its assets in the Middle East, in Africa, all around the world, in Latin America. In the Middle East, one of the assets of the Soviet Union, the KGB, was the Assad family, generation after generation. So one of the reasons Russia went to Syria was to protect its asset. It has military bases, important military bases in Syria, in Latakia, and other places. There are another, very important reasons for Russia to go there, including oil, including expanding its influence in the Middle East, etc. But also, this question also relates to the Circassian diaspora. Syria is one of the countries with the largest Circassian diasporas in the world. And when the war started, those Syrians, Circassians, started going to the Russian embassy asking for a refugee status, for visas, tourist visas, business visas, whatever, to just try to get back to their homeland, to Circassia, which is now part of Russia. Imagine that Russia actually denied most of them, some few hundred, less than few hundred people managed to get to Circassia through Turkey, and the whole burden on hosting, aiding those refugees fell on the community. There was not a single ruble coming from the Russian federal government. Moreover, some of those people were deported back to war from their homeland. So that's the Russian policy, another side of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bliss. I think we are at 15 minutes, 11 to 15. This went over by 15 minutes. I genuinely appreciate our panelists' time and patience and their incredible knowledge and expertise. I mean, like I said, this is the group that in many ways, brought this issue to the mainstream, and that's why there are so many conversations happening around this. I also want to thank just our participants for there were, like I said, there were a few questions that were, they were generally not to be meant questions, but more an effort to, I think, to offend us, which we're not offended. It's okay. This is a free country. Everybody can say whatever they want to do. But most of them, they were genuine questions, and I think we have tried to answer them all. And I just would like to offer maybe last comments before we wrap up, and then we can just finish this up. Anyone? Yeah, Casey, please.
Yeah, I'll just jump in very briefly. Again, just to circle back to where we were at the beginning of this conversation. I think there's a lot of, again, good faith, bad faith, whatever it might be, commentary surrounding the notion of decolonizing Russia or the decolonization process in Russia as kind of a veiled attempt at dismemberment or partition or whatever term you like to use, which is obviously not the case. But I do want to close with this quote, which has come to mind quite often on my end, which is, quote, "As much as decolonizing Russia is important for the territories it formerly occupied, reprocessing its history is also key for the survival of Russia within its current boundaries." Now, that quote comes from Dr. Moran, Dr. Kazanbekova, and a wonderful write-up they had recently, and I just wanted to make sure to insert that in there as we wrap the discussion today.
That's fantastic. I love that. Hey, anyone else, please feel free to jump in.
I think we had a very active person here, Mustafa. What's that? Where's his name? A comment here. It's too big for the discussion is too big for 1 hour. I completely agree, and I hope that we will continue discussing this topic. I think one other area, in addition to discussing Western scholarship, I think we should also engage the Global South. Why the Global South continues to consider Russia as anti-Western, anti-colonial power and denies the dignity of non-Russian people, and especially people of color from the former Soviet space. And we see implication of these attitudes now in how the Global South is reluctant in supporting Ukraine, Ukraine's plight against Russia's war. That's another territory where we can go in the future as well. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, I could probably just add as a historian that probably many people from Russia would say, what do we have to do with that? We didn't do anything. So I'd like to say that there is no, of course, the understanding of guilt, not collective guilt and not personal guilt. And of course, a lot of people and us themselves whose forefathers were probably engaged, in different atrocities, we don't bear that responsibility for our forefathers. The only responsibility that we have, and I would say it's a chance that we have, is to look at our past honestly, to listen to each other, to engage in an equal and respectful and sensitive dialogue with each other, to listen to each other's voices. It will make our societies better. It is a chance. Decolonization is a chance, is a promise for a better future, for a safe future. So if we want to take this responsibility on looking honestly at our past and listening to each other, this is the responsibility of our generation that we can take, and we can make a better world and learn from the past.
That's a fantastic point. Thank you so much for it. Ms. Liz? You're on mute.
Thank you. To conclude, I wanted to say that before this briefing, I posted on Facebook a question: what you, the Circassians, want me to say, to ask for? And the answers were anonymous. We want justice. We want the recognition of the genocide. We want to build a democratic future for our kids in a free society. And this is me speaking on behalf of those people. Also, I wanted to say that right now people are dying in Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for its existence. just like my forefathers fought against, the Russian imperial powers for their existence. We've lost, but I hope Ukraine wins for the sake of the entire world, because the world is not going to be the same as we know it today if Ukraine loses. So, glory to Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you so much. This has been, like I said, an incredible, I think, both educational but also emotional conversation. And I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of emotions running the gamut. And again, by no means, and I think we try to convey this message, this is not anti anything. This is pro something. This is pro peace. This is pro reform. This is pro justice. This is about things that every human being in the world wants for themselves, and as you, Ms. Liz, said, for their kids. This is what we want, and this is the first conversation in what it appears to be is going to be a series of conversations about this specific issue. So thank you so much to our panelists. I would be remiss not to thank Michael Cicere, my colleague my senior policy advisor at the Helsinki Commission, who, just driving force behind this. This is his brainchild. He put this together. He organized everything. So Michael, credit to you and to Rachel and Paul, who assisted or helped together. They worked on this. So Michael, kudos to you and credit to you. Again, thank you to everyone, and appreciate. And we're gonna continue this conversation maybe in a bit of a different format. Thank you once again. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.